Hello and welcome to Series 1, Episode 1 of Uprise Talks. I'm your host, Katie Booth, and I'll be chatting with the change makers and rule breakers who have rejected the status quo of a corporate 9-to-5 and are instead making their own paths in life. We live in an era where more and more of us are realising there's got to be more to life than the traditional career and are choosing to head out on our own in search of a more meaningful life. If you're on that journey, or perhaps you're staring out of your office or home office window, thank you coronavirus, and wondering where to start, you don't have to do it alone. We at Uprise are talking about the challenges, triumphs, and everything in between when it comes to the search for a life and career that makes you feel alive. So, let's get started. So, without further ado, I am very excited to introduce you to our very first guest. She's had a career that spanned 3 different industries in 3 different cities and started not 1, not 2, but yes, you guessed it, 3 successful businesses. Most recently co-founding social health startup Tribes. It's, oh no, I've just realised I forgot to ask you, how do you say your surname?
It's a hard one, don't worry. It's Justine Javier-Borja, so it's don't worry.
Justine Javier-Borja.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, let's do that again. Cool. So without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce you to our very first guest. She's had a career that spanned 3 different industries in 3 different cities and started not 1, not 2, but yes, you guessed it, 3 successful businesses. Most recently co-founding social health startup Tribes. It's Justine Javier-Borja. I hope I pronounced that right.
That's right.
Hi, Justine. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
Good. Yeah, very good. Thank you. Surviving lockdown so far. So 3 industries, 3 cities, and 3 startups is that the kind of secret to success that no one's heard about?
Gosh. I have never really thought of it that way. I think I just keep going, right? I just keep building, I keep thinking. I haven't really thought of it as like, I think it's a lot like you look behind you and you connect the dots from behind you, but actually, no one intends to do that. I do think I'm moving east. So I started in San Francisco. I went through New York, I landed in London, and now most of my family is in Asia. So there is
slowly making your way around the world.
There is something going on there.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Perfect. So you founded your first company literally as you came out of college. So you've pretty much broken the mold before you've even kind of had that taste of kind of, the normal jobs that probably most of your friends at college were going into. Where do you think that came from?
So I like to say that I was born into my first startup in the sense that my mom was an entrepreneur. So my mom actually, it sounds like a California cliche, but my mom actually had her office in our garage. It's much less sexy than it sounds. But I kind of grew up around startups. So like I licked the newsletters when they were letters. I went on like site tours with my mom. That was what we did for weekends. Like it was just kind of in and around us. Like half the people who took care of me were people that worked in my mom's company. So I kind of was always around work. I don't think I've always been around work growing up. I used to, exactly. You think about business before all of this internet banking. My mom used to like double park in front of the bank and I used to run in and deposit checks for her. Like that was, that was the world before. So I've always been around work and I've always been around entrepreneurship. I kind of didn't, I think I probably started, so I worked throughout my high school and I worked kind of more formally throughout college. So I did a bunch of internships in college and not even internships, I think full-time jobs, right? I worked for the general counsel of Stanford through most of my career at Stanford and and kind of wanting to get just money, but also exposure. So I think I had exposure to quite traditional jobs. So worked kind of for general counsel and like got a sense of like, what does law look like? And very quickly kind of knew that wasn't for me. And I did my internships at JP Morgan throughout most of my summers. So I had an internship in like, I had a job offer and an internship in banking, but I think because I was so focused about what I wanted to do, I started like exploring it and like touching it like really early on. And I think that's sort of been it. I realized when I got a job offer, I was like, wow, I don't want to be my boss. I don't want to be my boss's boss. I don't want to run this business. Like I could, at that point you're kind of like, fool, what are you doing? And so I think that was me coming out of college, had a job offer that I didn't take. And then it was kind of like, well, what are you going to do? And my mom, who was an entrepreneur, was very kind of open-minded. She was like, well, what interests you, right? What do you, and so it's what started, and I think that's kind of has been a pattern for me. It doesn't start out as like, I'm going to start a business. I've never been like, I want to start a business. It was more like, well, what interests you? Well, jewelry design interests me. And then she was like, well, where have you seen that work? And I was like, I've seen it work in Asia. And my mom sort of was very kind of open-minded to how you explore things. She was like, well, why don't we go there and look for it? And that's kind of snowballed into like a wholesale retail jewelry business, but I wasn't intending to do it that way. I was kind of exploring what was interesting to me. And I think I came from a base where it's beyond my mom, right? Most of my family is entrepreneurial or enterprising, which I think is slightly different than entrepreneurial. Like they are constantly looking for business opportunities and kind of open to it not having to look a specific way. And so I think I've been really lucky.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting, because a lot of people probably go through school and college and university and whatever, and kind of, they're a lot of the time, families will kind of have this expectation that, you go to college or university, you come and get your graduate job that's in like law or accounting or, those things, and then you settle down and that's your career and that's your life. And I think obviously having that exposure at a young age to something different obviously had quite a big impact on you and kind of where you've gone.
But I mean, the fact that I can explain it as like something I'm grateful for is now, right? Now, after a lot of therapy. Like at the time I was like, why is this so messy? Why isn't someone laying out a path for me? Why isn't, I'm first generation college. So people, like my family wasn't focused on that. And I had to do it myself because my mom was like, well, she comes from an immigrant background where you kind of, you make it work with what you have, and which now we call innovation and startup and entrepreneurship, but there it's just like surviving, really, right? And so it looks really messy. Now that I'm like looking back at it, I'm like, wow, thank God I had an open mind. Thank God I thought things were possible. But when you're 18, that's
you're just like a life stretching before, and you're like, oh my God, what the hell am I going to do with my life?
You're like, give me the answers, and maybe it would have been nice. Like I used to look at my friends and say, wow, like it's amazing that your dad's a lawyer and you want to be in law school. Like, that's
easy.
Simple and easy.
I do think it's interesting as well that you said you did kind of have exposure and you did try a few different things, and that kind of almost like process of elimination, and kind of almost seeing it as an experiment, like, okay, well, I tried that and they even gave me a job offer, but actually thinking about it, I didn't want it. And I think I think people need to maybe not be afraid to actually like try different things, and actually often there's a lot of pressure on yourself to kind of, I'm going to try this, I'm going to make it work, and this is going to be my thing, whereas actually you can try things and decide, oh, actually that was not for me, and do something else.
Which is, I think, again, like looking back at that now, I'm like, wow, that was kind of interesting. Like at the time, in the moment, you got to trust. It was like a gut instinct, right? And I almost hate when people say that, because it sounds like they haven't, it's like, well, that's great, but how do I do it? I do think there's something about when you just, you know, you're not having a good time, right? You know, when you're not having a good time. And we've done a whole lot to not listen to that part of ourselves.
Yeah, 100%. So then, kind of interestingly, after, you know, co-founding your first, you know, startup when you were right out of kind of college, you then kind of almost did the reverse of what other people do, which is then kind of go back into a more kind of corporate setting, and it was property and private equity and stuff like that. How did you find, you know, what was the kind of reason for doing that, and like how did you find that kind of shift back, or not back, but, you know, shift towards a different kind of career, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, so I had started a jewelry business. I'd moved to New York. I really wanted to build a business. And I was looking for different ways to do it, right? I started by myself, which was like a free fall. And I mean, founding something on your own is always just really scary. I mean, and if you think about it, you leave, that's what a lot of people go through, right? They leave a very structured environment and then they free fall, which feels a lot like that. It's like a groundless place. So what I was looking to do was like build some structure around that. So I was like, okay, this is really hard. I need to get a bit more experience. How do I do that? So I started, you know, applying for jobs in fashion, and I wasn't really, you know, again, like, you know, you apply for a job and I think on some level, people can sort of see that you're enterprising. So you're applying for a job to get experience, and that kind of comes through. People are like, okay, you're trying to get experience, go do your thing. And so I was finding it really hard. And my family, again, my family beyond my mom are just kind of really, it's almost like they're simple business people in some ways. So I remember my uncle in New York was like, listen, you can go to get experience. He's like, the other way to do it is you can just get capital, like make money, and then you can invest it in your business, and then you can afford to pay for your mistakes, which is kind of it's a very simple, you know, it's just a simple way of looking at business. Like
Makes sense.
Now it's like receipt, but before there it's just like, do you have money? You need money.
Yeah.
And so my family is in kind of property and in different ways. And so my uncle was like, super easy. Why don't you just do a bit of property, make some money, and then we'll be done with it. Property was very easy up until a point. That point was probably in 2007. So the like dawn of our global financial crisis.
Yeah.
Joining real estate, probably not the best. But that's sort of how I landed in that job, which I think it's funny because it's also like that job. So I was a broker at Cushman & Wakefield. Cushman & Wakefield, a huge corporate. And so in some ways it looked very corporate. So like a midtown office building, everyone like suited and booted. But in a lot of ways it was also a startup. Like in New York, that's, you know, it's a job that's 100% commission. So if there's, I mean, that's a startup. Like, it's also a job that, you know, you're on a team, but it's like whatever way you want to get there, whatever way you want to build a deal, get a deal, you know, go do it. And so in a lot of ways, I think it's sometimes funny what I kind of think of two things, right? I think of some people separate corporate to startups, and I actually look at them a little bit on a continuum. Like, there's elements of jobs that like feel very corporate, even, and you can find startups now who behave who feel very corporate, and then you can find corporates who look corporate, but at the thing underneath it is quite startup, you know.
More of a kind of mindset and a culture rather than like, you know, the kind of structure of an organization maybe.
Yeah, and I mean that, you know, selling property in New York it's a funny thing to do because it's so competitive, but people are, you know, there's something really funny about it. There's something really, it's just it's like pure, I think it's some of the most, it's 100% sales. And there's that I think is very startup, because it's like whatever you want to get, however you want to do it. And people, what you see inside an organization like Cushman is there's a few people at the top, and they all look super different, and they've all done it very differently. And I think that's a very interesting thing to notice.
It's kind of like being in a startup and kind of figuring out, you know, what your kind of niches or your USP, and even in that kind of corporate setting, you've got to find a way to differentiate yourself and kind of have that entrepreneurial thinking as well. Yeah.
And you run your business, right? You got to figure out how to bring momentum in. You need to I mean, I think that was one of the most beautiful thing about this first kind of job, right? Is it changed my relationship to work. So I think often if you go into banking, work happens to you. And so the thing, you're like, oh my God, I have so much work, and you complain. You'll never hear a salesperson complain about having work, because they just, their job is how to get work. Their main problem is not having enough work. And so it kind of changes the way you see work. Like, what you like is being busy. What you like is being like having a lot to do. That's never a problem, because that means it's going well. It's when you don't have a lot to do where it's like, eeks.
Yeah.
That's hard.
Yeah.
And it also, like, what it gave me was, so I went from, as a transition, I went from being a broker in New York to working in private equity in London. And that isn't, it's not an easy transition. But I think like my training in New York sort of made me, like, it was like, and I remember between those two jobs, I met probably 60 or 70 people. I was like hunting my next job.
And so, so talk me through that kind of transition. Why did you kind of make that decision?
So actually, like, this is really interesting. At the time, I was like, all right, so I have a bit of experience. I need to learn more. I've kind of hit a plateau in my learning. Most of my friends were going back to business school. And so I did that. I took my GMAT. I was like, I'm going to go to business school. But I think in my mind, I was like, all right, business school is really expensive.
So expensive. Like, crazy expensive.
And I have friends in the US who are still paying business school debt. I mean, it's just insane, right? So for me, it was like, okay, my mom's not going to pay for that. Like, I'm going to pay for that. I'm going to do it. I took my GMAT. I was like, I'm going to apply to business school. But then I was very clear, like, what is this going to give me, right? And a lot of what I was looking for in business school was like a sense of how business works, maybe finance, how to run it. Like, I wanted to get into the nitty gritty of the stuff I didn't know. Like, so I'd learned how to sell. And what I wanted to do was like learn how to operate a business, right? How to look at a spreadsheet, how to think more, maybe even quantitatively. That's sort of and I was like, okay, so I could go to business school and do that. It would cost me X. I think it's like $150,000, probably more. And weirdly, as a punt, I was like, okay, I could stay in property, and I could figure out how to take what I have, which is understanding how to sell and how to understand a market, and try to figure out how to get into the like the principal side of it, which is the more private equity side of it. Most of my friends at the time were like, you're nuts. So, like, the job you're trying to get is a job that we get out of business school. So good luck. Which I think I probably was too naive to understand that. Like, I think I didn't know, a lot of times what you don't know actually is good. Like, you don't know. So like, let's just see. And then, what I learned at Cushman was how to get a meeting. And I got 60 meetings, and some of them were brutal. Some of them were people saying like, yeah, like, no, not really. Like, you're probably too old to go to business school. You're probably too old to make a pivot in life. It probably doesn't make sense. And you're kind of like, thanks so much for your time.
How do you deal with like so many people telling you that?
I mean, it's
just crying.
Do you know what? It's like, it was because what Cushman taught me, right? Like, you're probably you can make 50 calls before you get a meeting.
Yeah.
That's just the thing. I think I was pretty bad at it. Like, it would crush me. So I took 60 meetings, and some of those were like, wow, I'm going to be like, do I end up working at Starbucks? Like, does this story end with me working at Starbucks? Like, like,
yeah.
And then I think you just get really lucky. So I got really, I mean, I don't know, after 60 meetings, I don't know if it's luck, but I ended up meeting someone and I helped him find, so I met, he was the global head of Merrill Lynch's real estate at the time, right? Which is like a huge job. But I was finding him his office space when he was spinning out a small company in New York. So this guy was like a mega real estate person, but I was helping him find like his tiny office space for 3 people. Like that was, and he's just, I don't know, he was just a really nice guy. And I remember saying like, okay, you know, who are the real estate people like that you think are great, who are doing things that are really different? And then he put me in touch with this company in London, and I was in New York. But I ended up, you know, going there, meeting them, and things like, you know, what you learn as a broker is when someone's like, hey, like, yeah, I'd like you to meet, you know, we do have this job, you know, but you need to meet the rest of the team. What you learn as a broker is to say like, great, like I'm in town on Friday, and people are like, but you're in New York. You're like, I know, I'll be in London on Friday. Like you just
passing by.
Yeah, you learn how to like find an opportunity and actually not let that go. In some ways, I need to go back to that because I think, you know, it's that's a muscle. Like if you're not working that out, it's hard. But in some ways, you kind of learn. Like I need to actually go back to that kind of state of mind where you're just like you're gonna do it.
Yeah, not taking no for an answer.
Or take a lot of no's and still be up for it. Yeah, that was, so yes, it was, so I think weirdly, like, even though it looks corporate, my experience at Cushman probably wasn't that corporate.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting as well, because I think, you know, we talk a lot about kind of finding, you know, meaning and purpose in your work in order to kind of feel fulfilled, and you know, that's really important, like, you know, obviously to kind of feel like what you're working on is kind of bigger than yourself and stuff like that. And I think a lot of people take that to mean kind of, oh, you know, I have to like suddenly have this big epiphany moment and find like my one calling in life, that I was like put on this earth to go and do this one thing. Where what's interesting is that your career has kind of spanned so many different industries, from like, you know, jewelry to private equity and property to a nail business. Like, so how do you think about finding kind of meaning in your work and like that purpose?
Yeah. I remember someone calling it the myth of the vocation. and I believe in the myth of the vocation. I think, I mean, I've definitely revised my view on this as we've gone along. I think for me, like, I think what where I am now with that is that when you say you need to find meaning in work, the person that it needs to make sense to is you. so it's a you know, it's like that. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, right? Like it needs to make sense to you. It doesn't need to make sense to a lot of other people. There are a million people out there doing a million different things. But like when you find meaning, it needs to make sense to you. And so for me, earlier in my life and my career, I think when I look back at it, things always made sense to me, but they made sense to me like this. It was more extrinsic. So I used to go by this formula of like, I'm going to do this so that I can do that. But so it's like, I'm going to do X and so that I can do Y. So I'm going to do this. So I'm going to build exactly how I landed in private equity. I need to figure out how to do finance so that Y. The funny thing about that is I never really finished the sentence, like, which is fine. I think early in your career, you are gathering skills, right? But at some point you need to finish the sentence. You need to know, so that what, like, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, my last pivot, because my last pivot was probably 2 years ago, 2 years ago now. Like that was when I stopped and I was like, okay, it needs to be more intrinsic. I'm going to do this because this matters to me. and I'm going to make a living out of it. Because I think before what it was like, I'm going to learn finance so that I can do X, which I don't know what X is, but somehow what that X is really is existential, right? I'm going to do it so I can support myself, so I can make a living, you know, so I can, I don't know, it's just so I can exist, so I can survive. Which, you know, when you look at that, it's mine, but it's also like, I mean, that's my like history, right? That's my mom, that's my grandmother, that's like most of my, like, that's like in my ancestral genes, like survive. But now it's more like, I'm going to do this because it matters to me, and I know that I can make a living out of that. I know I can make a business out of that. I feel confident that I'm going to do something that matters to me, and there's a way that matters to someone else.
Yeah. I really like that kind of idea of that kind of skills gathering stage, particularly when you're kind of, you know, in the early stages of your career as well, because like, as we were kind of talking about earlier as well, like you need to sometimes try things to figure out like what you're good at and what you're not good at, and what you like and what you don't like, and then, you know, hopefully at some point all of that kind of comes together and you're like, okay, that's what, you know, really matters to me, and I can now use all these like amazing skills that I've got. So it's that kind of matching up of your you know, what drives you and what matters to you with what your skills and experience are, and kind of, you know, the two together hopefully can
it's like,
something
I mean,
awesome.
it's that ikigai thing, right? So it's like, what matters to you, what can you do, and what can you deliver to the world. But that, you know, again, like it's all in reverse, in the rear view mirror, that you can see that. Because I think, you know, when I was at Cushman, I was just trying to figure it out, and I was like, you know, and it's also like, I've had friends who've been very successful from the very start and are still doing what they started doing when they graduated from college. I have friends who have never worked anywhere else than Facebook, you know, like all their life. And I have friends who are still in San Francisco. So like, which I think is hard when you sit next to those people, because in some ways you look at their LinkedIn and it's like 14 years in the same company, and then now you're a managing director, global head of something, right? And you're like, wow, that's amazing in some ways. And I think there's moments where you can really compare yourself to those people, and then you're like, oh my God, I'm an intern of life. I'm an intern but I don't know. I mean, on bad days, I'm like, wow, that's really scary. And on good days, I'm like, I kind of I'm like really happy with the choices I've made.
And
it's a different path almost, you know?
Yeah, I think people, that kind of mindset difference again between, you know, people who want or maybe are kind of suited to the more sort of, I don't know, I guess entrepreneurial careers, and kind of almost having that mindset of like always like being curious and wanting to learn more, and you know, always being like that beginner and learning new things.
Yeah, like if you know, what's I think really important actually, and what I haven't done until just now, is I've kind of had a very solo journey until now. Now I think, I mean, what I do in tribes and just in general is more about finding people, right? Finding your tribe. And I think what you realize is there are people who are just like think a certain way, and you know, we'll start a lot of different businesses in their life, and we'll have a ton of different failures, and we'll have lots of feelings about all those things, and then there's people who may have just and I think finding the people who are a little bit like you makes you feel normalizes it for you. I think that's really important.
100%.
Because or else you're just like, oh God, why am I so?
I'm such a weirdo. like what's wrong with me?
No, and you sit with people, but then you'll see, you know, you'll be around a dinner table, and I remember sitting with a friend of mine who's been a VC for a very, very long time and is very good at it. But in my mind, we were talking about a business, and in my mind, I was like, I know probably the next 4 steps to make, and I realized in her mind, like, that wasn't as concrete. Like I kind of we just had different ways of thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
Which is also good.
Yeah, definitely. And so in terms of kind of what you're doing with Tribe, so you describe it as a social health startup. What does that mean?
Yeah. So for me, social health is, it's how we relate to ourselves, and how we relate to others. So it's the quality of our relationships, but importantly, it's kind of, it's how we relate, right? It's our relational dynamics. It's the thing that sits in between me and you, right? And why that relates to health, it's actually, I've said this a lot, it's actually in the World Health Organization's definition of health. So when they were formed as an organization, they defined health. So this is like in the 1950s. They defined health as your complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not just the absence of disease, right? And now today we all, I think, understand that. We knew it before, right? So you can take a perfectly healthy adult and you can put them in social isolation, and very, very quickly their mental health, but also their physical health will deteriorate, right? So you kind of know that relationships matter, and you know that it's important. We know that, like, in the communities that live very long, that there is community, there's a sense of community, and that's leading to longevity. But what kind of struck me is, like, there isn't a lot of, if you think about physical health, there's not a lot of gyms, there's not a lot of, for social health, it's kind of like, well, relationships matter, we're kind of good at them. And then you look at, like, the world and you're like, people are having a really tough time in their families, they're really struggling at work. There's always a thing. So for, like, in my mind, we need to start thinking about, and often actually, I think a lot of the mental health issues are symptoms of social health problems, right? So people will say, like, but in a way, I kind of understand it, because I think sometimes people say it's my mental health, right? So I can deal with my mental health, but actually it may be the way your relationships, but it can go either way, right? It's just, I think we like to look at the things that we can control. So my mental health, I got control over it, versus my social health, actually it's between a lot of people and different things. So that's why what social health is and why it's important. And what we're sort of doing in that is we're looking at a way in which we can start to help people work with their social health. So what I just described,
like a gym for your social health.
Kind of, right? It's like exactly. It's like a space. It's a space, and maybe the start of our conversation around our social health. So we build tribes. It's called Tribes. And what Tribes is it's kind of a group experience, right? So we gather together tribes of 8 people that are peers. So we've built tribes of founders. We've built tribes of people around a specific concept. We've built tribes of people who are in transition. And so we gather them together, and then we give them the structure of a meeting. So they meet once a month to kind of talk about what's going on in their business life, but also their personal life. And what that looks like is, in some ways, when it's working really well, you kind of have like a board of you can think of it like a personal board of advisors. So you have people that start to know you quite well, who kind of help support you, but also help challenge you by asking good questions. And so there you're kind of practicing these ways of relating, right? So we're asking questions, we're listening. It's like how we show up, how we give and take feedback, like all these ways of relating is what you sort of practice in the tribe. So that's your workout. And then what you have is, like, when it's going well, it's amazing. So you have this support network. And when it's going badly, because I think actually tribes can be difficult, what it does is it opens up a whole new kind of work. So, if you think about it, you can be in a tribe with someone and you're like, wow, that person's really irritating me, really bothering me. And in normal life, you would just be like, I don't like that person. And that's sort of where it would end. And in a tribe, you're kind of like, we try to help you lean into that a little bit. So one, try to understand like, what about that person really bothers you? Often I think that shines a light on ourselves, because when something really bothers us in someone else, more often it's something that bothers us in us. But then also like, how can you have like a conversation around that? How can you give feedback in a way that it can be heard, and in a way that it's almost true, right? So we give, like, the tribes all they do some trainings, they do some work to figure out how they can give feedback in the right way. But that's sort of what it is. It's helping us try to start saying the things that are real to each other, so that we can kind of collectively improve our social health. Tribes.
Nice. Yeah, that's really interesting. I love that kind of it's like you have to work out for your social health and relationships. And I think it's one of those kind of like, I think people kind of see it as quite an abstract kind of thing, but actually it's so integral to, you know, like everyone's kind of lives and well-being, like how you interact with people, like at work, your families, your friends. Like it's not really something you can avoid. And like you don't get taught how to deal with that at school either. Like you kind of just have to, by trial and error, somehow figure it out as you grow up. And no one really teaches you how to do it. So I think being able to equip people with those kind of skills is it's really cool.
It's almost like, in some ways, you know, you're asking, I always say, I had a friend who came to me and she was like, you know, I really want to be more vulnerable with my husband. You know, we don't share a lot of things that are vulnerable. I really want to try. How should I do it? And I remember sitting there and thinking, oh my God, you know, that's really the Super Bowl of your life. Like, that is it. Like, your relationship with your husband, like, that's Super Bowl territory. You might want to try, like, are there areas in your life you can try like smaller? Like, so not like, you know, because do you really want to be at the Olympics day one, or do you want to find places where you can try to play with that and experience it? Because if you share, like, and I really want people, you know, everyone does want to be more vulnerable, because we understand that that's how we connect, but it is kind of like wobbly and messy at the beginning. And where can you start? Because it kind of feels like the world is like, you should do this thing, but we don't really have that many areas or arenas where we can practice. And that's, you know, when you think about it, like, think about your, like, for me, I always think my big feedback conversations at work, they've always been like so scary. And, you know, you kind of really want to practice run. So that's, I think Tribes is hopefully a place to do that. But then it's also just a place to kind of be there for each other. I mean, most of our existence on this planet has been tribal. So, you know, we're just going back to how we've done things before.
And on a kind of slightly topical note, I guess, now that we're all obviously confined to home and, you know, communicating through virtual screens and all that kind of stuff, like, what kind of impact do you think that will have, kind of, you know, when we eventually, you know, can kind of come out of it? Like, do you think people's kind of attitudes and perceptions towards, you know, how we connect with other people are kind of changing? Because I think you know, quite a lot of people have said to me, almost in a way, they're almost communicating more with their family and friends now than they ever have been before, because you kind of feel like you have to make that effort.
Yeah, I mean, like, so we incorporated Tribes about a year ago, and we incorporated under the Social Health LTD. And when we did that, we're like, no one's going to get this. Like, no one wants to talk about this. And we've, you know, like, even talking to founders about it, we're like, it's about social health. You know, that's the kind of byproduct. But what you know, we talk a lot about, like, being a better leader, because people want that. You know, or having people to be on this journey with you, because people want that. But no one really, like, the idea of social health was like, what is that? Like, sure, tell me that later. I think now we all have a sense of like how, because everyone's having different feelings about it. There's days where we're more connected. There's days where we feel, you walk down the street now, and if someone comes towards you, you perceive that as a threat. That's a very different social behavior, right? That brings about some quite antisocial behavior. And then on Thursdays at 8 p.m., you step out onto the street and you clap. And most people I've talked to are like, I get really emotional when that happens. Like I clap for NHS and I get quite like, it touches me, So
I've definitely teared up.
Yeah, right? You're like, oh my God, we're in this, like, God. What's funny is when people tell me that, it surprises them. They're like, I'm surprised at how emotional I get. So in my mind, I think like there's a lot of crazy stuff that's coming out of this. I think the one thing that comes out of it is that people like meaningful connection. I think people are going to come out of that really wanting to figure out ways to build that. Which is, I think, the silver lining. Like, you realize, like in my world, everyone talks about retreats and like silent retreats and really finding a place to pause and all of this. We've just had a global retreat.
Yeah. I think that's kind of how, like, personally for me, like I've found, dealing with it when it all first happened, obviously, like it's like a scary thing. It's like, oh my God, we're all in lockdown, like this is the world's falling apart, like what's happening. And actually like having that realization of, oh, actually this is kind of like, it's obviously horrible what's happening, but in a way I've now got time that I never had before, and I can like think about things more deeply, and I can do those things that I never kind of normally do. And yeah, having that kind of space just to like stop, because we never had that before, especially like when you're running around 100 miles an hour in London. And so yeah, I think it's definitely kind of the silver lining.
Have you seen for you, how do you feel like it's impacted your relationships? Like how has it been? Has there been something for you where you're like, wow, that is unexpected? Or
yeah, I guess it's interesting. Like I think it's like, for me, definitely I'm someone that I've always been really bad at like replying to messages and like reaching out and like just calling people. I just like, I don't know, I'm just not very good at it. Maybe I'm really antisocial. But now like I've been surprised like at myself in terms of thinking like, oh, actually I'm just gonna like call that person and just see how they are. And like I think it's been quite good for me in that sense. I've also obviously started working with the team at Uprise Academy, and have done that completely remotely, which seems absolutely bizarre, but like, you kind of just, you find a way. And I think the longer it goes on, the more we can kind of just accept that, this is life now, and you just have to kind of find ways to carry on, really keep calm and carry on.
yeah. And that's so intense to start a new job with a whole new team totally virtually, right? That must be,
yeah.
But then in some ways you've met, like I know some of the people you work with, and I feel like they are, I mean, you're still meeting people. I don't know, there's something about, I think that's the marvel of technology, right? You're still getting to meet people, to connect with them face to face. It's not the same as being in a room. And we'll all, I mean, particularly for you, I'm quite curious about how it will be the first time you meet, and you're like,
I know, I'm so excited. I'm going to like get into the office and just like hug everyone and be like, oh, I finally meet you.
But like, it's like that, but also I've seen the lower half of your body. like it's stuff where, so I think, I don't know, I'm glad it's interesting what you say about having, not being someone who, I have friends who are not particularly connected on digital devices, as in like when you see them, it's like everything's the same, but they're not like ones for long chats, right? They don't like to respond to the group, and and how that's changed, and how you have different kind of conversations on phones. Because it does change. Like we launched a bunch of tribes virtually for the first time, and again, it was like people meeting, and there's so much that's happening. You're meeting people for the first time, you're going through an emotional experience, you're doing it on Zoom, you're doing it during a lockdown, which means there's so things like, in a group dynamic, you have moments of silence, and they are what they are. Silences on Zoom are very different. Like, there's a part of you like, my tech's not working. Like, there's no silence because my tech's not working. Whereas it's different in person to person.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, no, it's interesting. So we actually did a workshop a few weeks ago that was about kind of this, how do you create meaningful connections with people online, through Zoom or whatever it is. And there's almost two sides of it. Like, we found, I think some people kind of find it harder because there's that physical barrier between you, right? Like, you're talking between a screen. But in a way, especially if you're meeting with people who you've never met before, there's kind of almost that distance can make it easier to be more open and more vulnerable, because you're like, oh, well, like, that person doesn't know me, or I'm never actually going to meet that person, so it's fine. And you can kind of almost, it gives you a bit of it's that space to be vulnerable. So
I was on a Zoom. I'm doing some training as a group analyst, and so we had a Zoom meeting with someone who's done a lot of group therapy online, which is like almost unheard of, because group therapy really relies on you being in a room, and group analytic therapy is like, has so many rules with it. But what I thought was interesting about what this guy said was, he started with saying, like, wow, look at us, we're all in different places, in different time zones, and we're connecting. He's like, and he was like, how unnatural is that? And how magical is that? And I thought, like, for a second when he said that, I was like, yes. And he's like, and doesn't it feel that way? And I'm like, wow, what a perfect way to introduce it. Because yes, we're connecting over distances in time that we shouldn't be connecting over, because it's not, like, physically that's not possible. So that's something unnatural about it. But then there's something quite cool about it. Like, I can see you, and you feel, in the actual experience, you feel both of those things. You do feel like it's unnatural, and you do feel like it's technology, right? It's amazing. And I don't know, when he said that, I was like, oh, okay, so how I feel is actually what's happening, and that makes me feel slightly better. Like, I don't have expectations. It shouldn't be, it's not like it shouldn't be the same as a physical meeting.
Yeah, that's so true, actually. I think, like, consciously, I think, trying to, obviously people are kind of jumping on Zoom calls and doing, I've done about 1,000 quizzes, I think, in the past 6 weeks, and kind of trying to do that to to replace what you would obviously normally do when you see your friends or whatever. But you're right, like, it's never going to be, we need to kind of stop thinking of it as like, oh, this is weird because it's not the same as normal. Obviously it's not going to be the same as normal, it's just, this is something new that we have to do now. And it's magical in a way.
Yeah, it is.
Cool. So just conscious of time, so I guess a couple of kind of final questions to wrap up would be, for someone who is maybe, perhaps because of the times we're in or whatever, are kind of starting to think that actually they're not sure what their current career is right for them. Maybe they're kind of feeling like, actually, this isn't really fulfilling me, and I know this is what I don't want to do, but I have no idea what I do want to do. How, like, what kind of one piece of advice would you give to someone that's kind of going through that and kind of thinking about where to start?
So I think I've probably had 7 pivots in my career. I've done this a few times. I think there's two things, right? I think there's one, it is messy. It is messy. And it's like saying that out loud is like, this is a messy time. It is. Most pivots and transitions like require a wobble before you got to think of Bambi, right? You're like wobbling before you can walk. So like that, you know, and because that, acknowledging that, I think it's useful to have a structure. I think, and so for me, I think what you guys are doing is amazing, because I think actually having a structure, so two things that I've learned, like one, a structure, and two, people to do this with, because both of those things, I just, having done it alone and by myself, like it just doesn't need to be that way. This is something that a lot of people are going through. And you can do structure, you can do stuff, you can go to formal programs, amazing. If you can't do that because, you know, it's not something you can afford right now, I think there's two books that I think are quite useful. Like I think I give them to a lot of people, because people come to me and ask me this question all the time. So there's like Working Identity by Hermione Barra, who's a professor at INSEAD, who talks about like what your identity looks like and she gives quite a good structure of it. And it's quite European in the way, so I think it's deeper and it's a bit, in some ways, like more rigorous. And then one I just read, which I think has definitely mapped with my experience, is Design Your Life, which is a book. It's also the most popular elective at Stanford. So it's like about design thinking, and it gives you a kind of a structured way, because of what it looks like when you're trying to figure, when you're like, okay, I don't want to do this, but I don't know. I think it can be quite messy. And so knowing that you're probably not the first person who's ever done it, useful. And then having kind of a framework to think about that. And I think, you know, if you can gather people to help you to go on that journey with you, I mean, that's just the way I would do it. Because, and you know, she talks about it in Working Identity. She's like, so often, you know, you do need to make, it's tough, but she talks about like how you make new friends, like how you, not new friends, but you kind of reach out to new people that you don't know, because in some ways you need to find the next community, community that you're in right now, which is where your job is, like that's what you know. You kind of need to get into another pond to start to feel around in different. And so there's, you know, there's just good ways of thinking about it. And in Design Your Life, he gives which is a really easy book to read. Like he gives a great stat on like the hidden job market, which I think is a big wake up call. So I think he says that like 1 out of every 5 jobs is kind of posted online. 4 out of the 5 jobs are in the hidden job market, which means that you need to have kind of right. And that's like I think that's like research based. That's not just, these guys are like engineers from California, so I'm assuming that's kind of research based, but it definitely mapped with my experience. I've never gotten a job that's been posted online.
Wow. Yeah. And I think, as you know, as well, just like reaching out for that next community, as you said, and kind of connecting with people who are in other spaces to you. I mean, that in itself, I think, is also just a really good way to kind of talk to people. So like, you know, if you start thinking, oh, I think actually I might enjoy being, I don't know, a product manager, surely it makes sense to go and talk to a load of product managers, or, you know, people who are in that kind of field, to kind of work it out.
But but then it's also like, I think it's super scary, right? Making new friends and reaching, it's like knowing that a lot of people do that, I think is really helpful. I mean, knowing that you're not the only person who's constantly saying like, hey, do you want to, you know, I think I got into using LinkedIn and reaching out to people and saying, hi, like, I saw your profile. I'm really interested in what you do. You know, do you have time for like a quick call, and can I just ask you a few questions? And it's awkward like the first time, it's awkward the second time, and then quite quickly you're like, no, that's just you know, we're so used to Tindering. People can Tinder for it, but like we can't do that for our jobs, right? Like,
I know. Maybe it's I think British people especially are probably too find that kind of thing really hard. culturally we all need to be a little bit less British about our sort of job hunt and stuff like that.
I think I really like it on LinkedIn, because I think it's not like you've never, for a lot of people, I would imagine your market, right? They have jobs, they're in corporate. So you're not like what it allows you to do is it allows you to connect with people while saying like, I'm a real person, this is what I've done, because it's there, right? So it's a tiny bit easier, a simple note of like, hey, and because I've reached out to a lot of people in that way, whenever people reach out to me, I'm always happy to have a chat.
Yeah. And I think more like, I think people are so scared of just being told no, but actually like
very few people.
So what? Like,
well, no, but very few people don't. A lot of people don't respond. Fine, but like very like, yes, you can't like. I think it's, I have some friends who are quite senior in organizations, and they're always like, I always think it's easy, like, everyone wants to reach out to, the Michael Jackson of their industry. I don't know. Does that make sense? Like, probably not. Why don't you reach out to someone who's like kind of at your level and then have a conversation with them? And you know what I mean? You don't have to reach out to Michael Jackson. You can actually, that shows how old I am, my reference. You know what I mean, though.
Sorry, it wasn't that long ago.
He's still an icon.
Still an icon, yeah, exactly. Cool. Awesome. Yeah. Well, Justine, thank you very much for your time and for doing our minimum viable podcast over Zoom. I'm really sad we couldn't do it face to face, but such is life at the moment. So yeah, it's been weird but magical, as you said. And yeah, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. It was a lot of fun. Cool. And I hope everyone, I hope people, I guess what I'd say is like, I know this is like a scary moment of transition for a lot of people, but I think some real magic can come of it. For it may not be the way you thought it was going to happen, but I think you hear this all the time. I ask a lot of people about their stories, and you hear this all the time. The things that they really didn't want to happen ended up being the things that changed their life. You don't know, and that's just a kind of the way you look at it.
Yeah, definitely. Amazing. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to episode 1 of Uprise Talks. If you like what you heard, make sure you subscribe. Every fortnight, we'll be talking to the world's changemakers about all the highs and lows of taking the journey to a career that makes you feel alive again. For more information on how we help driven people find meaningful lives and careers, head over to our website www.uprise.academy or follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram @Uprise Academy. We'll see you in the next episode.